In the spring of 1925, a well-dressed man walked into one of the grandest hotels in Paris, sat down with one of the richest scrap metal dealers in the city, and sold him the Eiffel Tower. Not a model of it. Not a share in it. The actual Eiffel Tower, 7,000 tons of iron, the most famous structure in France, sold for scrap, to be torn down and carted away. There was just one detail the buyer didn't know. The man across the table didn't own the Eiffel Tower. He didn't work for the government. He had no more right to sell that tower than you or I. And when the buyer finally realized he'd been robbed of a fortune, he did something stranger than the crime itself. He said nothing. To anyone. Ever. So how do you steal a landmark in broad daylight, and get the victim to guard your secret for you? This is the story of the greatest conman of the 20th century, and the trick underneath every scam since. Follow the money. His name, or at least the one he used most, was Victor Lustig. Born in 1890 in what was then Austria-Hungary, he called himself Count Lustig, though he was no more a count than he was a government minister. He spoke several languages, dressed impeccably, and carried himself with the easy charm of a man who belonged in every expensive room he walked into. Over his life he used something like 45 different aliases. Charm was his whole toolkit, and charm, it turns out, is the most valuable tool a thief can own. In 1925 he was in Paris, reading the newspaper, which is where every good con begins, not with a lie, but with a truth you can bend. The papers were full of a genuine public argument. The Eiffel Tower, built as a temporary exhibit for the 1889 World's Fair, was never meant to last. By the 1920s it was rusting, wildly expensive to maintain, and more than one Parisian thought it was an eyesore that should simply come down. The city was openly debating what to do with it. Lustig read that, and where everyone else saw a maintenance problem, he saw a stage. If the public already half believed the tower might be scrapped, then a man who arrived with the right paperwork, at the right address, could make them believe he was the one selling it. So he built the costume. He had a forger produce official government stationery, naming him the Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs, the department that, at the time, plausibly oversaw the tower. He didn't need a disguise or a fake beard. He needed letterhead, a title, and a good hotel. Because a con doesn't work by hiding who you are. It works by giving people an authority figure they already expect to exist. And then he sent his letters, not to the public, not to the press, but privately, to the 5 biggest scrap metal dealers in Paris. Discreet. Confidential. A matter of national importance. Please come alone. The meeting was held at the Hotel de Crillon, then, as now, one of the most prestigious addresses in Paris, a place that reeked of officialdom and old money. That choice was not vanity. It was part of the machine. A swindler in a back room is a swindler. The same man in a suite at the Crillon, with government letterhead, is a minister. The setting did half the lying for him. He gathered the 5 dealers and told them, gravely, that the government had reached a difficult decision. The upkeep of the Eiffel Tower had become impossible. It would be quietly sold, as 7,000 tons of scrap iron, to a single buyer, and, because the public would be outraged, the whole thing had to remain absolutely secret until the deal was done. He even quoted famous writers who had mocked the tower, to make the demolition feel not just plausible but overdue. Then he watched them. Because the con was never really about the tower. It was about finding the one man in the room who wanted it badly enough to stop thinking. He found him in a dealer named André Poisson. Poisson was wealthy but insecure, an outsider who longed to be accepted by the inner circle of Parisian business, the kind of man for whom a secret government contract wasn't just money, it was a rival. Lustig could see it. So he leaned into that hunger, made Poisson feel chosen, handpicked for something enormous and confidential. And Poisson agreed to pay around 70,000 francs, a fortune, hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money, for the right to scrap the most famous tower on Earth. Now here is the detail that reveals Lustig was an artist, not just a liar. With the deal all but closed, he did something that should have blown the whole thing apart. He leaned in, lowered his voice, and asked Poisson for a bribe. A little extra, personally, to make sure this particular contract went to him and not to a competitor. A corrupt official, greasing his own palm. And that request, which should have screamed fraud, did the opposite. Because in Poisson's mind, a real government official is exactly the sort of man who'd ask for a kickback. The bribe didn't make Lustig look like a crook. It made him look real. Poisson paid the price, and paid the bribe on top, and walked away certain he'd just pulled off the deal of his life. By the time he understood what had actually happened, that the letterhead was fake, the ministry connection was fiction, the tower was never for sale, Lustig was long gone, on a train to Vienna with a suitcase of Poisson's money. And this is the part people can't believe. Poisson never called the police. He was a proud, ambitious man who had just been made a complete fool of, and the shame of admitting it, of telling Paris that he'd handed a stranger a fortune for a building he didn't own, was worse to him than the loss of the money itself. His silence wasn't a lucky break for Lustig. It was the design. The con was built, from the start, to make the victim complicit. Lustig was so confident in that silence that a few weeks later, he came back to Paris and ran the entire con a second time, with a fresh set of dealers. This time, one of them went to the police before handing over the money. Lustig slipped away again, this time across the Atlantic, to America, never once charged for selling the Eiffel Tower. Because the tower, extraordinary as it was just one performance in a very long career. Lustig's signature product was a small wooden box he called the money box. He would show a wealthy mark a beautifully made machine and explain, in confidence, that it could duplicate paper currency perfectly. You fed in a genuine banknote, and 6 hours later, out came a flawless copy. He demonstrated, producing real bills he'd hidden inside, and then sell the miracle machine for tens of thousands of dollars. By the time the buyer realized the box was just a box, and the 6-hour delay was simply Lustig's head start, he was already in another city, another name. His nerve had no ceiling. At one point he walked into the orbit of Al Capone, the most dangerous man in America, and persuaded him to hand over $50,000 to invest in a scheme. Lustig took the money, did absolutely nothing with it, sat on it for 2 months, and then returned every dollar, explaining sadly that the deal had fallen through. Capone, who had surely never seen a swindler give money back, was so impressed by this honest man that he handed Lustig $5,000 just to help him out. Which was the entire con. Lustig never wanted the $50,000. He wanted the reputation, and the 5. But the habit that finally caught him was counterfeiting. Lustig ran a printing operation so large that, by the mid-1930s, federal agents estimated it had pushed more than $2 million in fake notes into the American economy. In 1935 they finally arrested him. And even then, he refused to play the part of a captured man. The day before his trial, he faked illness, tore his bedsheets into a rope, and climbed out of a window of a federal jail in the middle of New York City. They caught him 27 days later. This time there was no charming his way out. Victor Lustig was sentenced to 20 years and sent to Alcatraz, the one prison built specifically to hold men no institution could contain. And there the greatest con artist of the age finally ran out of exits. He died in 1947 of pneumonia, a convict, his occupation on the death certificate reportedly listed, with perfect irony, as salesman. So what did André Poisson actually buy that day at the Crillon? Not scrap metal. Not the Eiffel Tower. What Poisson bought was a story about himself, the story of a man finally important enough to be handed a secret national contract, chosen above his rivals, welcomed into the room where the real decisions get made. Lustig didn't sell him a tower. He sold him the version of himself he most wanted to be. And a person will pay almost anything, and forgive almost anything, for that. That is the mechanism underneath every serious con, then and now. The forged letter, the fake box, the fictional ministry, those are just props. The real product is a flattering story the victim is desperate to believe, wrapped around their own greed or vanity so tightly that questioning the deal would mean questioning themselves. And the masterstroke, every time, is to make the mark complicit, to give them a secret to keep, a shame to hide, a reason to stay quiet and blame themselves instead of you. You will see this exact shape again and again, in the investment that's offered only to special insiders, in the opportunity you're lucky to have been chosen for, in the deal that has to stay confidential just between us. Whenever a stranger hands you a story in which you are the clever, chosen, fortunate one, and asks you to keep it quiet, you are not being flattered. You are being measured. Victor Lustig understood, a century ago, the thing every scammer since has relied on: people don't fall for lies. They fall for the version of themselves the lie lets them believe. A forged letter and a good hotel in 1925, a stadium, celebrities, and a Super Bowl ad in 2022. The costume changes, the con doesn't. If you want to see Lustig's exact trick run on a global scale, manufactured trust, and billions gone, that story is one click away. Follow the money.